So the warning is not intended to stop you from purchasing it. The intention is to prepare you for some potential outcomes. And we know it's to cover their bases so they don't end up in court. Now, the reality is when God gives us warnings, God is not afraid of being drug into court. God gives us proper warnings so that we have accurate expectations when we maneuver through this thing called life. Now, the classic warning that Jesus wants us to be aware of is recorded in John chapter 16, verse 33. Now, let me give you some background in John chapter 16. Jesus has just told his followers that he will be killed. And these first disciples were guilty of what, well, we are all guilty of from time to time. This first group of followers is hopeful that Jesus is going to slug Rome in the figurative nose and to use his power to set up an earthly throne. Even though Jesus, time and time again, would tell his followers, my kingdom is not of this world. Now, at the time Jesus lived, the contents of John chapter 16, his followers were under the illusion that the world's going to fall in love with our Jesus. And they, the disciples, will get to live in this world filled with peace and joy on earth. But Jesus informs them, I will be killed for who I am. And who was he? He was God. Jesus didn't die for what he did. Jesus died for who he said he was. It's a necessity because your sin, Jesus is telling us, is lethal. And you need to have a perfect sacrifice to pay for your sin. If heaven is going to be in your future, you need to have someone pay your sins, because if you pay for them, you will be separated from God for all eternity. Jesus then reinforces this idea of the need for suffering by placing John chapter 16, verse 33 as a warning label for every individual that aspires to follow Jesus Christ. And this is what it says. These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. But, here's the warning label, in the world you're going to have tribulation. You're going to have trouble this side of heaven. But then he goes on to say, take courage, I've overcome the world. So God, through Jesus, his son, gives us the warning. As a follower of mine, you will have trouble in this world. Why? Well, the evil one hates us. He wants you to buy into his lies. And he wants you to think, well, if I experience something wrong, like a fire, if I experience some sort of difficulty, the evil one wants you to think, well, maybe there's something wrong with me. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. Because many times when we suffer, it could be because we're doing that which is correct. God warns us about how the evil one wants to shade us. Not so that we will stop doing what we're doing, but so that we will be prepared and not be caught off guard. The Apostle Peter says it another way in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12. He says, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, as though some strange thing were happening to you, as though some strange thing were testing you. See, this struggle on earth helps us answer the age-old question, well, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Now, this presupposes we think that we deserve good anyway. But let me give you a couple of reasons why God allows us to struggle this side of heaven. First of all, if we never experienced evil, we would not know how good can be. And second, if we were unaware how evil can be, well, you'd never appreciate the God that overcomes the world full of evil. Now, when you truly see how evil Satan is, it will motivate you to worship Jesus, because Jesus' actions on the cross are greater than Satan's hellish maneuvers. Last week, I entered our time, for those of you who are here, we got a call from dear friends about a week and a half ago. We've known them for over 20 years. Their 24-year-old daughter had taken her life. We had been in contact with them for quite some time. We knew the struggles that Emily was going through. And Emily was a believer in Jesus Christ. But she succumbed to the evil one's lies. And they asked me if I would come and do the funeral. That's what I did. I went to Alabama last week and was fortunate enough to be able to lead the memorial service for Emily Littleton. And my message was simple. My message was, God is greater than our worst mistakes. And nothing overcomes the cross. The cross doesn't submit to the evil one's lies, but the cross overcomes what the evil one can dish out. Now, just because Jesus allows suffering to expose us to his overcoming goodness does not mean that we go looking for suffering. You follow Jesus, knowing that what Jesus has for us is greater than what suffering can dish out. God allows suffering because devotion to God is greater than any physical or emotional pain. And Jesus overcomes what the world dishes out in human suffering. And I believe that God gives us Acts chapter 21, verses 1 through 26 to warn us, but not to stop us. So what I'd like to do is I would like to use the map that we've been going to tell you what took place in verses 1 through 16 of chapter 21. Because in verses 1 through 16 of chapter 21, it's basically Paul's travel itinerary at the end of his third missionary journey and how he got to where he is in Jerusalem at the end of verse 16. Now, let me go back. In verses 1 and 2 of chapter 21, it says that he started off his trip in Miletus. Let me kind of find where he is here. I want you to see kind of central to the west of the map. There's a big Caria. Up there to the left is Miletus. Now, Paul had been in Ephesus for 2 years, building the church in Ephesus. He travels down eventually to Miletus, and Miletus is where he asks the elders of the church at Ephesus to join him. I believe that in chapter 20, it's the greatest gift to spiritual leadership. If you want to be a spiritual leader, your keys are found in chapter 20 of the book of Acts. The principles are wonderful if anybody aspires to be a leader. He spends over a week with these guys in Miletus. But now he's going to journey home. Eventually, he wants to end up in Jerusalem. So verses 1 through 16 is kind of going from Miletus all the way down here where he goes to Tyre. He's going to go to Ptolemais. He's going to go to Caesarea. And he's going to go to Jerusalem right here. That's his destination in verses 1 through 16 of chapter 21. So we follow it along. In verses 3 through 4, he sailed past Cyprus to Syria, landing in this city on the coast. I'd like you to just go ahead and keep that map up there if you would. He's going to go up the coast. He's going to hit Tyre. He's going to go past Cyprus. He's going to hit Tyre. And there in verses 3 through 4, he's going to land in Tyre, and he's going to be there for 7 days. A group of disciples, followers of Christ, spend time with him. Now, Paul had been told earlier in chapter 20, verses 22 through 23, that persecution awaited him. Now, there is warnings to him. Believers who are joining him on this coast near Tyre are warning him. Now, who's right here? Should Paul continue to go to Jerusalem even though they're warning him, saying, you're going to run into some tough stuff? Should he not go, or should he go? See, the principle here, avoidance of pain, is well-intentioned, but not always the will of God. And in verses 5 and 6, as he sailed from Tyre, brothers and sisters prayed for him on the shoreline. And then in verse 7, he arrives at Ptolemais. Again, Christ's followers greeted him there. The church has been spreading to every port around the Middle East. And then in verses 8 and 9, they came to Caesarea. They stay at a fellow's house named Philip. Philip is the same one we looked at several months ago in Acts chapter 8, verse 40. Philip was the one who shared Christ with an Ethiopian eunuch. Philip had a label. They called him Philip the Evangelist. How'd you like to be called that? Your reputation is, well, Philip, he's going to share Christ with you. What a wonderful thing to have hanging on your mantle, Philip the Evangelist. And then in verses 10 through 14, a fellow by the name of Agabus. He's in Caesarea. It says he came down from Judea. Now I want you to see this a second. It's like, okay, so Agabus is a fella who's a follower of Christ. He lives in Jerusalem. And he comes down to Caesarea. Now you and I, when we look at a map, we think of south is down. There in the Bible, anytime it goes up or down, it's not as a result of north or south. It's altitude. Jerusalem is high in altitude. And so Agabus comes from Jerusalem. He goes down to Caesarea. He's going down in altitude. Agabus, in verses 10 through 14, loves God, and he also has a good relationship with Paul. And he goes, bro, I got to warn you. He takes off Paul's belt, probably a little bit different than our belt, and he takes off Paul's belt, and he binds his hands with Paul's belt. And he says, if you go down to Jerusalem, this is what's going to happen to you. The Jews down there are going to bind you, and they are going to turn you over to the Gentiles who are the Romans. In the same way that Jesus was bound and turned over to the Romans, he's predicting that you too will be turned over. Paul's response to Agabus is saying, hey, I'm ready to be bound for the sake of the gospel. If this is the Lord's will, so be it. Now again, the warnings from God were not for the purpose of stopping Paul from going down to Jerusalem. God was using these warnings so that Paul would not be taken off guard when he arrived in Jerusalem. Please observe, for Paul, being obedient to God's will is far more important than the avoidance of pain and suffering. God is most glorified when we praise him even in the midst of our suffering. So then in verses 15 and 16, they loaded up the wagons and they went to Jerusalem. No fear. They wanted to obey Jesus over the opinions of others and over potential danger. We now pick it up in verses 17 through 20 because Paul is going into Jerusalem. Please follow. Verse 17, he says, after we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. Now, the church leaders were not the problem in coming to Jerusalem. They were happy to see the Apostle Paul. Verse 18, and the following day, Paul went in to be with James as the elders were present. James, the brother of Jesus, and the elders of Jerusalem came to meet him. They wanted to hear about his report of his missionary journey all over Greece and throughout the Middle East. Verse 19, after he greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through the ministry. Paul retold the details of his ministry, why he aggressively proclaimed the gospel to the Gentiles. And then in verse 20, and when they heard it, they, the church leaders, they began glorifying God. They said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. They didn't question the fruit of Paul's ministry. They didn't question Paul's love for Jesus. Now let me clue you in here. Verse 20 exposes an idea that will be developed in the following verses. There were thousands of Jews in Jerusalem that have come to know Christ, and they are influenced by a false narrative. A false narrative, a false story that's been fabricated, has been percolating throughout Jerusalem. These thousands of people who have come to know Christ are under the impression, because Paul has taken the message of Jesus to non-Jewish people as well as Jewish people, that Paul is shutting out the Jews from the rich Old Testament teachings that led the Jews to the Messiah in the first place. Look at verse 21 and 22. And they have been told about you, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to their customs. Verse 22, what then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. So Paul is being informed that these Christ followers that came from Jewish backgrounds have been told that they are to turn their backs on their Jewish heritage, to walk away from the teachings of Moses, to walk away from all of their customs that they originally put in place to lead the nation of Israel to Jesus in the first place. And that is a total lie. It's a total lie. Paul taught the whole of Scriptures. Paul had just gone to great lengths to teach the elders in Ephesus that the Bible is one book, and the Old Testament prophecy points to the Christ, and the New Testament looks back at the Christ and what he did on the cross. And this false narrative contradicts the fact of what Paul was living out. Let me take you back to Acts chapter 18. Paul chose to follow a Nazirite vow. If you remember back at our time there, a Nazirite vow was a voluntary Jewish vow to set yourself apart for God's use. It's centered around abstaining from wine, letting your hair grow out for the time you designated for your period of dedication. It was a Jewish practice to say, I'm dedicating myself to the Lord for a certain period of time. You chose what period of time that would be under a Nazirite vow. You let your hair grow out. Well, Paul was doing that. In fact, Paul was still under his designated period of dedication under this Nazirite vow. He came back to Jerusalem planning on cutting his hair and culminating his Nazirite vow in Jerusalem. So this narrative that Paul was against his Jewish heritage, this false narrative that he disrespected the fathers of the faith in the Old Testament, is a total lie. I want you to observe something. The enemy is incredibly crafty. He prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. And if an enemy cannot accuse you of an actual crime, what he will do is he will create a false narrative so that the public opinion is turned against you. The evil one does not care what method works as long as he can cause division in the body. When you walk in this church and when you leave this church, you are marked, because the evil one would love nothing more than to cause schisms in this body and for us to turn on one another. That's why Satan loves a good rumor mill. Fabricated stories based upon lies are his specialty. Paul would write his beloved disciple Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:7, and he would use these words. He would say, have nothing to do with worldly fables. Satan loves to create worldly fables. You see it all the time. He loves the gossip train. He loves a rumor mill. So the leaders of the church have a suggestion. They've got a false narrative that's brewing all over Jerusalem. So they come up with a plan to basically knock off this lie at the knees. Look at verse 23 through 24. He says, therefore, do this that we tell you. We have 4 other men who are under this vow. In other words, there are 4 other followers that are currently taking a Nazirite vow. Verse 24. Take them, purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, Paul, so that they may shave their heads, and all you will know that there is nothing in the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. Now, the application was simple. Culminate your Nazirite vow with these 4 other faithful men, Paul. And Paul, you pay the expenses for all 5 of you to complete the Nazirite vow by having your hair cut to show the Jewish Christian community that what has been said about you are nothing more than lies, that you are not throwing away your heritage. Now I want you to see verse 25. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, he wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what was strangled, and from fornication. What in the world is verse 25 pointing out? Well, let me take you back. Verse 25 is about an agreement. an agreement that the church in Jerusalem had already agreed to during the last time Paul was in Jerusalem. And that agreement was that when a non-Jewish person comes to faith in Jesus, they're not required to follow all of the Old Testament mandates. The point was, all the Old Testament mandates pointed people to Christ. Christ is the one that saves. All the mandates were not what saved people. Jesus, the one that these mandates pointed to, saves people. So if the Old Testament laws did not save the Jews, then why should we think that the Old Testament laws would save non-Jews? That's what verse 25 is about. Now, please understand verse 23 and 24. This talks about Christ followers in Jerusalem that came from a Jewish background. And they had been lied to that Paul was turning his back on his Jewish heritage. But please note, the Jews in Jerusalem that were not Jewish followers had caught wind of the same lie. And this is the group of people that Agabus prophesied about that wanted to bind Paul and turn him over to the Romans. These were the Jews in Jerusalem that heard Paul was telling people to throw away their Jewish heritage. And this Jewish crowd was incensed in the same way that they were incensed about Jesus claiming to be God himself. Now, I want you to put a bookend on this. I want you to see and observe verse 26. So Paul, he follows the advice of the leaders. He took them in, these 4 other men, the next day, purifying himself along with them. They're following the Nazirite vow. They go into the temple giving notice of the completion of the days of purification. They're completing their Nazirite vow, their Jewish vow, until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. Paul did exactly what the Jerusalem church leaders suggested. He obeyed his authorities, and it was a great plan. By fulfilling the Nazirite vow, no one could argue that Paul was turning his back on his Jewish heritage. If someone in ministry, let me just kind of make a pit stop here. If someone in ministry has been in ministry long enough, they will have stories that have been fabricated about them to turn the popular opinion against them. Let me give you an example. Years ago, Julie and I, we were in Tuscaloosa. I was pastoring the church that was there. And I was approached by someone that accused Julie and I of seeking a job somewhere else, which wasn't true. They approached me with the attitude of, I've got you. We know you've sold your home so that you can be freed up to flee when you land another job. We've got you. Well, true, we had just sold our home because we were downsizing, because we were entering the fraternity of empty nesters. Now, I said to them, if I am plotting to leave behind your back, why did we purchase a smaller home that was a wiser investment? Oh. I remember here, Julie and I, we went on a sabbatical after our 8th year here. It was right on the end of COVID. And someone approached Julie and I after we went on our sabbatical and said, I know you're not coming back. Pastors who go on sabbatical, they never come back. And I know you're not coming back and you're looking for another job elsewhere, which was totally not true. Julie and I went on our sabbatical with the intent of honing our skills in ministry so that we could be as effective as we possibly can here. We had no intention of going somewhere else. In fact, after COVID, we were convinced when God's through with us, we're going to finish here. And so we don't exactly know that timeline. I'm 63. I think I've still got a little bit in the tank. I have told the elders, I've given them permission if I'm slurring my words. And where's Dan? Well, he can't find the sanctuary again. I've encouraged them to show up at my door and gently kind of help nudge me on. There was one other lie that while I was here, it was like, Dan, all he does, and Daniel and I have talked about this, all he does is he finds somebody's message on the internet, and he prints it off. He just puts the print pushes the print message, and then it's like I get somebody else's message, and then I just deliver week from week that message. Well, if that's the case, then why is every message that I've ever written in my hen scratch? If I'm just printing off those messages on the internet, then why do I've done such great links to write it in my own hen scratch and to write it on every message I've given over the past 40 years? Now, the reason I'm sharing that is not to go, oh, woe is us stories. Everybody has those stories. Satan loves to create unfounded stories. He loves for us to believe false narratives. Expect it. Now, let me kind of give just a real quick concluding thought here. Paul took the Nazirite vow, not for his salvation, but to sharpen his effectiveness for the salvation of others. And Paul understood the culture he was a part of. Paul was not going to disregard his culture. He was a part of a Jewish culture. Paul was going to use the good things in his culture to direct people to Jesus. And that's why for the 21st century Christian living in Nebraska, there are things in our culture that are of great value. Lent, 40-day prior to Easter, doing without. Palm Sunday, Passover, a simple fast. These things are not the gospel, but Paul would instruct us, why not use these traditions to point people to the gospel? Use what people already value to point people to Christ, the one who is of supreme value. Now let me get back. I want to pull this all together. Do you remember the warning? God warns us not to stop us, but to prepare us for what is to come. You follow me? That's the big idea. And Satan will try and discredit you through some way, shape, or form. I want to go to my favorite warning label. I didn't share this with it in my top 10. I saved it for here. This is true. Superman costume. There's a warning label on a Superman costume. And the warning label says this: this costume does not enable flight or super strength. I'm looking for the Superman cape, the one that can enable me to fly. Do you have that? This one says it doesn't. I want the real legitimate one. I mean, isn't that great? They literally have that warning. I mean, I guess too many kids were jumping off their rooftops thinking they were going to fly. Now, I know that that is true because I want to take you back on a field trip. This is a true story. Dan was 6 years old. I had a Superman cape. And I remember I could run faster with that Superman cape on. I was fearless once I put that cape on. Until one day, I was running, and this is true, I was running down the street with my Superman cape on. I mean, it was the real deal. You know, had the emblem on the back. I was running, and the cape was longer than I was tall. And somehow it got tangled up in my feet. And I am running, and all of a sudden the Superman cape gets tangled up in my feet, and I bit the dust. You remember as a 6-year-old can, go back with me. You remember when your feet, your body's going faster than your feet, and I went down. Knees on the concrete, hands on the concrete, elbows on the concrete. And of course, I'm 6 years old, and I'm unashamed to say I cried. I mean, that hurts. All those abrasions, they hurt. And I went back inside, and I took that cape off. And I think the thing that made me more furious than anything else is I said, this cape doesn't work. See, one of the great warning labels that Paul gave us, it's printed on our forehead. It comes out of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5. It says this: not that we are sufficient to claim anything as coming from us, for our sufficiency comes from God. See what he's doing? He's warning you to start thinking that when you start thinking you're all that, you will trip on your proverbial cape. When you start thinking, oh, I've got it down in this area, you know what? God will expose you because he will show you you are not sufficient of yourself, and you will trip on your proverbial cape. Jesus is our power source. Jesus is our power source alone.